Poštovani gledatelji, dobar dan. Danas govorimo o drogi, točnije marihuani. Zbog čega se svakodnevno regrutiraju novi korisnici? I pitanje svih pitanja, zbog čega su uopće počeli? Čini se u drogama nema razlike. Znatiželja, socijalizacija, bijeg od trenutačnih životnih problema. Onima drugima, preprodavačima, to je izvor brze i u nekim slučajevima velike zarade. Čini se da je tako stvoren zatvoreni krug. Porast korisnika ovisnika, uz sve veću proizvodnju i sve širu distribuciju i obrnuto. Mreža kriminala ne poznaje granice. Reakcija većine na to je gotovo kao vatrogasna mjera. Kako ih kazniti i zaustaviti? Zakoni i mjere prevencije mogu dosta, ali nisu svemogući. Preporuka je stoga, kaže dr. Slavko Sakoman, i mladima i odraslima. Ne koristite drogu, koristite mozak. Budite mudri, nemojte početi. Dakle, odustanite od isprika. Pa nije to ništa ozbiljno. Mogu ja to prekinuti kad hoću, pa i to su lake droge. Kome šteti, na primjer, marihuana, rekreacijska droga? O zabludama i znanstvenim spoznajama upravo o marihuani govorimo u današnjoj emisiji. Koliko su za stajalište da je marihuana neopasna, krivi sami roditelji, koji su 70-ih prihvatili marihuanu kao rekreacijsku drogu za opuštanje, nešto što ne može štetiti. Marihuana je dobila zapravo jedinstven status, da gotovo nije droga. U Hrvatskoj, na primjer, godišnje se popuši 12 tona marihuane. 2000 novih korisnika regrutira se svake godine. U Velikoj Britaniji 38% mladih do 16. godine probalo je marihuanu. Gotovo 1 od 10 postaće redoviti korisnik. To tvrde statistike. A stručnjaci, rani početak i redovito korištenje može imati i ozbiljne posljedice. Istodobno u parlamentu u Odboru za ovisnosti vode se rasprave na osnovi novih spoznaja treba li ili ne pooštriti mjere i marihuanu staviti u onu višu, opasniju skupinu opijata. Pogledajmo do čega su došli britanski stručnjaci.
I only tend to smoke really nice stuff. Otherwise, I just don't bother smoking. It's the lightest, most creative, most inspiring weed. Yeah, it's very sensual.
These men are cannabis connoisseurs.
What it's like for me to be stoned is it's much deeper than your straight. I've just got to deal with stuff, consciousness. I've got to pay my bills and I've got to go to the post office and all. It's contemplation.
I mean, I love smoking it right at the end of the day. Then I can think about the day and what it means and find meaning in it. Contemplate, absolutely.
And now the next generation of users are starting younger and smoking more.
I love to wake up and have a spliff. I love to have a spliff before I go to bed. I think it's great.
We'd even smoke in the playground.
In the playground on the benches. Leave school and smoke some more. Yeah. Come to the park, have some more. But we enjoy it so much.
Over the last 2 decades, cannabis use among under-16s has increased tenfold. Tonight, we examine new scientific research and ask how much harm is cannabis doing to the mental health of young smokers.
So when did you guys start smoking?
The start of year 7, really.
So we're talking 11 to 12-year-old kids?
Yeah.
And you're telling me that you had your first spliffs, your first joints when
we
you
weren't
were
smoking
11, 12?
It was about then, yeah. We weren't smoking as much as
No, firstly, I mean, that is quite young to start taking
Yeah.
any drug, really, you know, anything.
Yeah.
Can you tell me some slang names for cannabis?
Puff.
Puff.
Weed.
Pot.
Green.
Green. Yeah.
Skunk.
Skunk.
Grass.
A drug education class for 12-year-olds. By the age of 16, 38% of British children will have tried cannabis. Almost 1 in 10 will be a regular user.
How many of you know people that smoke it? We don't want any names, but you know people that smoke it. Okay. Right.
Cannabis has insinuated itself deep into British society.
I don't really class it as a drug.
You don't class it as a drug?
No,
It's like a fag.
it's like a cigarette.
But it's not as much as a big deal to us anymore. It's just cannabis.
Yeah. It's just a smoke, really.
Champions of cannabis say the public is ready for full legalisation. And the popular perception is that the drug is virtually harmless.
Parents who used cannabis in the 70s or so developed a view of it as a recreational drug, something that doesn't cause anybody any harm. I think in many ways they are conveying that image to their own children. Now it's penetrated all levels of society and has achieved the kind of unique status of almost not being a drug at all.
The truth is these people here.
Those attitudes made the decision to lower the legal penalties for adults relatively uncontroversial. But there is now growing evidence that teenage users, for whom possession remains an arrestable offence, may be taking a risk with their long-term health.
We're supposed to be chilled out. Come on.
In March, the government announced a review of its decision to relax the cannabis laws.
Hiya. I'm from a mental health charity called Rethink, and we're just sort of asking people, do you know anybody that's had a bit of a problem with it? You do.
Terry Hammond believes cannabis can have a serious effect on the mental health of many young smokers.
Like a little bit mad.
He does get a bit angry, a bit aggressive.
Does he? All right, OK. Yeah, well, look, give that to his mum, all right?
He's absolutely convinced it's what caused his son Steve to develop schizophrenia.
Cannabis was the trigger. Because he was smoking the cannabis, he was beginning to binge on it. It could well be that Steve may have what they call a vulnerable personality, and I think that's probably the case, and that he may be somebody at risk. But I'm pretty sure, had he not taken cannabis, he would not have developed schizophrenia. I've got no doubt about that.
Some psychiatrists are also persuaded of the link between cannabis and schizophrenia, the most serious form of psychosis. Long-term psychotic illness is rare. About 1 in 100 of us will experience it at some time in our lives.
Traditionally, people with schizophrenia, many of them have had problems right throughout their life. They've maybe had some developmental problems, or as children, they've been to see child psychiatrists, they didn't get on with the other boys and girls at their school. And then they gradually slipped into developing schizophrenia.
Professor Murray has been treating patients in South London for over 20 years. He says that in the late 80s, the sort of patients he was seeing changed.
I was seeing patients with the psychosis who had been very normal as children. Children who'd been great at school, who'd been academically successful, who'd been very sociable, who'd been very sporty. Really kids that every parent would be proud of and wouldn't think there were any problems. And then they went psychotic. Now, that is much more unusual.
The one thing these patients had in common was cannabis. Professor Murray had always believed, like most psychiatrists, that cannabis did not play a role in mental illness. Many parents questioned that.
I still see parents who say that their son or their daughter, less commonly, has been seeing a psychiatrist, and they've always said to the psychiatrist, could it be the cannabis? And the psychiatrist has said, no, I don't think it's anything to do with that.
The view in the profession was that people who are prone to psychosis take cannabis to calm themselves down. Professor Murray and his colleagues took a closer look at some of their patients.
We found that the people who kept taking cannabis were 3 times more likely still to be psychotic, still to be hearing voices, still to being deluded after 4 years. So we got to thinking, maybe if once you're psychotic it makes you worse, could it actually have contributed to developing psychosis in the first place?
James started smoking dope at the age of 14. Pretty soon, he was using it almost daily. James became anxious and paranoid. He then made a common mistake. He thought that smoking more cannabis would make him feel better.
I thought, like, to get to sleep, I could smoke dope, because dope relaxes me. So I bought an eighth and I smoked the whole thing. And then I was walking back to my dad's and I started hearing voices and they're, like, shouting at me.
What sort of things were they saying?
They're saying, like, "Oh, you come over here, I can help you." And I was just really paranoid. Then I started thinking that the police were after me. And I thought that they're, like, invisible policemen with guns and they're holding them to my back.
Did you know that they were, like, in your head, or did you think that they were real voices?
I thought it was all real. And I was going pretty crazy. And I kept on crossing the road, and I kept on, like, speaking to myself quietly, saying, "Oh, I'm right." And then I'll cross onto the right side, then I'll go, "No, no, no, I'm wrong."
As soon as I opened the door up, James came in, I could tell there was something really, really wrong, because he wasn't even standing still on the spot. He was just kind of like jumping up and down. He couldn't keep his feet still. And it was quite a job for him just to take his shoes off when he got inside.
James was having his first psychotic episode and was referred to a psychiatrist.
Psychosis is really a description of a mental state of an individual who in some way loses their connection with reality. So they may develop abnormal actions and experiences, and on the basis of those abnormal experiences they may develop abnormal beliefs. And these experiences and beliefs drive their behaviour and obviously make them behave in ways which can be unpredictable, can be bizarre to other people, and can at times be violent.
I started thinking that the TV was speaking to me. But I saw, like, a prince in it, and I thought that as Lucifer, which is, like, real name for the devil. And I thought that was, like, my story.
And then he started to say that he was Lucifer, the devil, and his whole face changed, and he put on this awful voice saying that he was Lucifer, in this horrible hissing voice.
I started to think that the movie was changing. The words that I was saying was making it change, and I thought that people were, like, changing it on computers to the story of Lucifer. And I thought that was, like, the true story of Lucifer, which was my film, because I thought it was the devil.
I didn't know whether he might try and attack me if he thought he was the devil. But basically it went on like this, sort of like all through the night, with a loud telly, you know, and the voices, and turning the lights up bright, you know, all through the night. And I phoned my sister about 6 o'clock in the morning and said, "Help."
James, who's now 16, ended up here in a secure adolescent mental health unit.
The majority of young people who are admitted have a psychotic illness of some kind, and looking into the histories of those young people, cannabis use would be present and probably playing a significant role in the development of their problems in at least 75%, perhaps as much as 90%.
Cannabis would play a significant role in more than 3/4 of the
Yes.
people that you see here.
Yes, and in fact it's unusual for us to see a young person with a severe psychotic illness where there has been no exposure to cannabis at all.
Researchers around the world have followed thousands of young people as they grow up. Their work suggests the likelihood of experiencing psychotic symptoms is increased if you are a heavy cannabis smoker during your teens. Dope smokers were found to have an almost 1 in 10 chance of developing symptoms of psychosis by their mid-20s. Not only that, the earlier you start and the more you smoke, the higher the risk of illness. Some of the effects that dope smokers savour are actually very similar to the patterns of thought of patients with psychosis.
Part of the intoxication experience may well include psychotic-type symptoms, and indeed, some people may really enjoy that.
The gives me something I'm quite addicted to, and that is the feeling of, aha! It allows me to step back and see the big picture.
Puts you into a very analytical, not in a sort of Dr. Spock kind of that is a logical captain, but in a kind of examining things and analysing maybe the currents that go with it, you know.
I've had people describe to me thoroughly enjoying absolutely psychotic symptoms, like, for example, smelling colours or seeing sounds.
Cannabis seems to connect parts of your mind to each other in ways that it doesn't normally do, and then you can really make sense of things.
A psychotic symptom is really a misinterpretation of reality. A psychosis is a bunch of those symptoms which causes me to lose touch with reality.
For most cannabis users, the symptoms of psychosis disappear as the drug wears off. Most, but not all. When James started smoking dope, it was he'd smoke with his dad. His parents had separated. His dad would even buy cannabis for him.
I was smoking it virtually every day, and I was going to say, yeah, I'll keep on smoking it till I die. I love it and all this stuff. I even got a tattoo of it.
I found out that he started smoking, and I wasn't very pleased about that. But I didn't actually know much about cannabis. I wasn't sure how worried I was supposed to be.
Looking back, his mother now thinks the first subtle signs of James's problems might have been apparent quite soon after he started smoking.
His personality just seemed to change, really. He was just getting a lot more serious, sort of grumpy in the mornings. He's lost his enthusiasm for anything. So it was a bit hard to tell whether that was just part of being a normal teenager or whether there was something more to it.
She was worried enough to take James to the local GP.
The doctor said that he'd been more worried about James smoking normal cigarettes than he would about him smoking cannabis. That James was basically just a normal teenager.
Scientists are beginning to understand more about what it is to be a normal teenager. It had been assumed that by the teens, brains are pretty much fully formed. We now know the adolescent brain is a work in progress, rewired right through the difficult teenage years.
There are changes in the architecture. Many cells are making new connections and branching out. Other cells which don't seem to be needed are literally being pruned. And these changes are occurring particularly in the parts of the brain that are responsible for reasoning and problem solving. And it's those areas that seem to be particularly vulnerable in early adolescence, vulnerable to exposure to drugs, including cannabis.
This is one of the few farms in Europe licensed to grow cannabis. These men breed cannabis for scientific research and for medicinal use. Cannabis contains hundreds of different chemicals, 60 of which are unique to the plant.
Here we are looking to breed a stable quality. We want the same amount of THC.
THC is the chemical that gives dope smokers the high. Until recently, very little was known about how THC, the active ingredient of one of the most widely used recreational drugs in the world, actually works on the teenage brain. The big breakthrough came in the 1980s. It was discovered that cannabis binds to receptors found throughout the brain and that it mimics naturally occurring brain chemicals. So this network of receptors was named the cannabinoid system after the drug. Professor Yasmin Hurd has been studying the cannabinoid system for a decade. So Yasmin, this is a human brain.
Yes, it is.
So which parts of the brain does cannabis affect?
Cannabis affects a large part of the brain because cannabinoid receptors, where cannabis works, are located throughout the cortex. All of this is our cortex, and this is our cerebellum, important for motor coordination, and cannabinoid receptors are all over the brain.
So cannabis really has a very profound effect on the brain, affecting almost all the brain functions.
Exactly. So cannabis affects learning and memory, it affects pain regulation, motor function, emotional regulation. So because the cannabinoid receptors are one of the most abundant receptors throughout all of the brain.
Just to remind you that you have please to look to the monitor and...
Using the latest scanning technology, scientists can see how cannabis stimulates a key brain chemical, dopamine. It's known as the reward chemical. When we eat, have sex or take drugs, it is dopamine that transmits feelings of pleasure in the brain. It is now recognised that dopamine has other functions too.
Dopamine is the chemical which grabs your attention. So if suddenly something exciting happens, then this is mediated by dopamine. You pay attention to something when dopamine is released. And in psychosis, what people find is everything seems to catch their attention. That a little noise, or the way that somebody grimaces, or somebody new comes in the door, or they hear something on the television, all of these things seem to be tremendously important. This is because the dopamine makes them important, and then they think, gosh, these are really important to me. They begin to connect them. They think one is connected to the other. They think the television is talking to them. They think the neighbours are conspiring against them. And it's the dopamine release that causes people to develop these delusions.
What role does cannabis play in the dopamine system?
Well, the cannabis just revs up the dopamine.
Mark has been a heavy dope smoker since his early teens. He's developed some alarming symptoms and has been referred to a psychologist.
When I was trying to get to sleep, I'd like close my eyes and put my head down, and I could hear my mates talking. It was two of my mates just talking to each other.
What, like having a conversation?
Yeah.
In your head?
They were there talking to each other about the most randomest things. Like, I don't know, probably talk about skateboarding or something. And then it started going on to, I'd open my eyes and I could see people standing at the bottom of my bed and stuff.
Mark and his friends are in their late teens. We've disguised their identities, not because they're dope smokers, but because Mark has been identified as being at risk of developing psychosis. His mother and doctors want to protect him from the stigma some still attach to mental illness.
Did you ever feel paranoid?
Well, yeah, paranoid just pisses you off because you can't do anything. You can't relax or anything without being worried that someone's there, constantly looking over your shoulder. I couldn't walk down alleyways with my headphones in and everything. I'd always look behind me.
Because you'd feel nervous?
Yeah, at some points I've just took my headphones out and ran. Just like ran.
Although there was no one there?
No one's there, but you just run anyway because it's proper freaky.
Most people who smoke dope in their teens do not develop psychosis. So why do some? Professor Murray wondered whether those that do are in some way more sensitive to the drug. Might it have something to do with their genes?
We think that cannabis has its effect on the dopamine system, therefore we wondered whether people who differed in the genes which metabolize dopamine might contribute to the susceptibility.
The results suggest that differences in the genes that help regulate how that key brain chemical is broken down do indeed affect how likely teenage cannabis smokers are to suffer mental illness. As someone who smoked cannabis in my youth, I wondered whether I might have been at risk. A simple blood test would help me find out. I am a recreational smoker, which Panorama didn't know when I was asked to work on this story. These days I only smoke tiny amounts. When I was 15, it was different. I smoked a lot of dope at weekends and sometimes became paranoid. So much so that I stopped using it for many years.
So that goes off to the laboratory now, does it?
Yes. Excellent. The results of my blood test would not be back for a couple of weeks. For some young smokers, cannabis is woven deep into their social lives.
To be honest, I reckon I'm addicted to it.
Like, not physically addicted, like mentally addicted. Like, if I don't have a spliff, then I'll try and find ways to get in one.
But that sounds like an excuse to me.
Yeah.
Cannabis is not physically addictive, but users can become very dependent on it. Those who work with dope smokers know how the drug can come to define an adolescent identity.
It grows more into their whole social circle, so all their friends will smoke cannabis. So if they want to go out and socialise, they can only do that with somebody else who will also want to smoke cannabis.
The majority of people I know smoke, and...
If you were with your mates and you said, look, I don't want a spliff, I mean, you'd sort of stand out a bit.
Yeah, you'd be the only one not smoking.
And the longer they've smoked, the longer they've been in that social circle, the more reduced like their social network will be.
Even if you wanted to not smoke, it's quite awkward because you don't have to ask for a spliff, it just gets passed to you.
So in fact, it's an active, you have to actively opt out.
You have to say, no, I'm not having any.
And then everybody will be like...
And then they'll be like, oh, then. And then they'll roll another one and pass it you, like, first or something, because they want to see if you'll crack.
Dr. Skeet has told Mark to stop smoking.
Amanda says if I keep on smoking cannabis, there's a chance I can develop schizophrenia.
Doesn't that give you a sort of pause for thought?
Yeah, it helped me cut down a lot more. But, I mean, I don't know. Cannabis it's like a hobby now. I've got used to smoking it that much that it's just forced habit.
What does it look like? This one is cannabis bush. This is called...
At this school in Kent, they're trying to educate children about the dangers of drugs, including cannabis. The more they know, the better equipped they'll be to resist peer pressure. The school is worried about the latest research. Many children know how easy cannabis is to come by.
If you know someone who takes cannabis, you could probably just ask him.
If you know, like, friends of friends, then it's quite easy to get hold of it.
How many people think if they wanted to get hold of cannabis, they could get hold of cannabis? So that's like probably, what, over half the class?
I'd say it's over half the class.
But the children are confused about the legal status of the drug.
Can you have a small amount, enough for one joint on you? Is that allowed? Is that allowed? Who thinks yes? It's very confusing, isn't it? It's a Class C at the moment, OK? But if you're caught with it at your age, under 18s, it reverts back to a Class B. OK?
So cannabis is illegal, OK, which means you can't have it.
You know, strong varieties of weed that were pretty strong, and you'd go, whoa, and you could only get them sometimes, and it was great. Now, they've crossbred those. You know, they've got 20% THC content in them. Ridiculously strong, way too strong for me. I have to water that down.
Yeah.
Way down, just to, if I want to carry on being a responsible person. That's what all these kids don't realise. They get a £10 bag of weed and they put it in one spliff and they go, and then they're like, you know, catatonic. And of course, I mean, that's ridiculous. Yeah. It's just ridiculous.
Skunk is strong because it has been crossbred for its high THC content, which is boosted by being grown under lights. How many young smokers actually use skunk is another matter. It is expensive, and the best estimates suggest that skunk varieties account for just 15% of the UK market. It is frequent, heavy use that seems to be the real problem. We didn't have to spend very long with Mark and his friends before that became clear.
So what effects do you think smoking all this cannabis has had on you?
Not being able to sleep. Yeah, it helps to sleep sometimes. I occasionally get like random voices in my head and...
What, actually hear voices?
Actual voices. I've had a conversation with myself.
Speaking out loud?
Speaking out loud.
Don't you find that worrying?
I don't really find it too worrying, but I'm still 99.9% sane.
You're on medication for your depression?
No, except for I'm on medication for depression.
It can be hard for anyone to acknowledge that they may have symptoms of mental illness. Harder still in the difficult adolescent years. It becomes even more difficult when, like Mark and his friends, you get stoned a lot and so become accustomed to having strange thoughts and strange experiences.
And a certain amount of unusual experiences is accepted within the groups, but what our clients find it hard then is that they've got much more severe problems, or they're also getting paranoid 2 days later when they haven't had any cannabis, or when they're completely on their own or in the middle of the night. And it's really difficult to say to their group, you know, I don't want to smoke it, and, you know, I'm beginning to get mentally unwell.
This confusion and denial may help explain why many young people, their parents and their doctors do not spot the warning signs until it is too late. It is time to find out the results of my gene test. It would show if the gene that helps control the breakdown of the reward chemical dopamine makes me particularly sensitive to cannabis. What has happened to someone in my family has made the results even more resonant.
During the course of making this programme, a relative of mine was hospitalised with a psychosis associated, it appears, with his teenage cannabis smoking. And a lot of people we've spoken to have said they know people who this has happened to too. How widespread do you think this is?
I don't think we know how widespread, but like you, I've been surprised that it's not just people who develop a full-blown psychosis, but out in the population at large, there are lots of people who have a brief paranoid episode. Fortunately, it goes away after a few days. I think one of the useful things about this program might be that you would get better information, or that it would become more widely known that this is the case.
His studies show that genes do seem to play a role in how sensitive people are to the drug. In fact, for 1 in 4 people, the chance of developing psychosis is increased tenfold if they're frequent cannabis users during their teens.
Well, Robin, I've got the test result here. I don't know the result, so let me just have a look. Well, that is unintelligible to me.
Well, this actually shows you that you would be one of those individuals who are relatively unlikely to go on to develop psychosis.
But genetic makeup doesn't offer any guarantees. The genes that help regulate the reward chemical dopamine in the brain are just one factor in the development of psychotic illness. Age is another.
What about adult cannabis smokers?
I think the evidence is that the risk for adults of developing psychosis is not so great. In fact, you're actually getting through the major risk ages for developing schizophrenia, because it's a disorder of those between adolescence and about 30.
What Professor Murray and the other scientists have done is use population studies to show that heavy cannabis use in your teens can increase the probability of developing psychosis.
When was the last time?
What they have not proved is that cannabis actually causes psychosis. To do that would require evidence that using cannabis physically alters the brain.
Probably need to find out why.
Which is precisely what scientists in Sweden believe they have done. They exposed adolescent rats to THC, the chemical that gives dope smokers the high, and they found long-term changes in their brains. They also gave rats THC in adolescence, or while their mothers were pregnant. They wanted to see if it would affect their behaviour. The researchers tested how likely the rats were to use a switch to give themselves small doses of heroin.
We saw that animals that were exposed during development took more heroin as adults. They were also more sensitive to stress in that they took more heroin when they got just even very mild stress, and they were sensitive to even lower concentrations of heroin than normal animals that never got THC during development.
As if there was some kind of predisposition to take heroin, having been exposed to cannabis, to THC in their early lives.
Exactly. I would call it more of a risk. So they increased their risk factor, the vulnerability for taking more heroin due to the early exposure to THC.
Professor Hurd is a leading brain scientist with an international reputation. Her work may reignite a long-standing debate about cannabis, that it can make users more likely to use other drugs. But the implications of her THC work are much wider than that. She found physical changes in the rats' brains, changes she has also found in prenatal human brains exposed to cannabis.
So if we cut the brain in half, and we will just look at one hemisphere.
Using an adult brain, she showed me the area that has changed.
We saw that, and in the rat models, we saw an area that's called the nucleus accumbens, which is very, very highly associated with reward. It is considered part of the reward circuit, the central reward system in the brain. That is highly changed.
The brain has changed.
The brain has changed.
What has changed is the central reward circuit, the dopamine system. That's the system that may provide the link between cannabis and psychosis.
If she finds long-lasting changes in these areas, that cannabis has altered the dopamine system, and so that the individuals will be more sensitized the next time they encounter a drug like cannabis.
So this takes us towards a proof of what has been a hypothesis underlying your work, that cannabis does have long-term changes on the dopamine system.
Yes, and it's not so unusual for a drug to have long-lasting changes. We know that amphetamine or heroin or even alcohol can produce long-lasting changes in the neurochemistry of the brain. So this is really rather as one would have expected, but thank goodness somebody has now done it.
Professor Hurd's work has not yet been published or replicated, but she says it confirms the unique vulnerability of the teenage brain.
Absolutely, because the circuits, the synapses are not all formed as yet. So a drug has more ability to impact the final formation of the brain.
So if you start smoking at 12, the chances are you will not be the person you would have been had you not smoked cannabis.
Correct. Does it mean that you're a better or a worse person? No, but you are definitely a different person.
It is a controversial conclusion. Some will argue about the full implications of the changes she has identified. 16-year-old James had recovered well in the secure adolescent unit. Medication had helped control his psychosis.
I got better after a month, and I went home for Christmas.
What did the doctors say to you?
Don't smoke dope ever again.
And what did you do?
I went out and smoked dope.
As I started to go upstairs, the music seemed to be getting louder and louder, and it was really very loud in here, and it was very haunting. Walking in here, James was talking to himself quite clearly, very, very confused again.
Psychotic?
Yeah, as I entered the room, I really couldn't believe that everything was going wrong again so soon.
I had this weird feeling swept over me, and all of a sudden I thought I was the lead singer of a band called Danny Filth. And I started like singing to it, and his vocals were like screaming and roaring.
There may still be doubt about whether the illness James suffered was caused by cannabis. But there is no doubt about cannabis causing relapses in psychotic patients. James was taken back to hospital.
I did feel like I lost him because this psychosis had taken over part of his personality. Just wasn't James anymore. And that seemed to be more powerful than anything else.
He really seemed to be inaccessible to us for quite some period of time. And he would disappear into a place where he felt terrified by everything that was going on around him, and really in immediate fear of his life.
This psychotic episode was much worse. James was profoundly ill for over 2 months. At the unit, it is a familiar pattern.
Young people who may have used cannabis at very high levels in the past only need to be exposed to relatively small amounts to to develop symptoms.
I was worried about you. Are you worried about you? You're not worried. Why not?
I can handle myself. I don't really care about myself that much. It's more my family, hurting them and everything.
Isn't that what all kind of adolescent boys say? They don't care about the future, they don't care about themselves. But when the future comes, you probably will care. You know what I mean?
I know that, like, if it happens in a few years, I'm going to be looking back at myself and thinking, you're a dickhead for doing it. But at the moment, I'm living in the moment.
And is that all right? Is that a good enough explanation?
James has spent over 4 months at the secure unit since his relapse. Today, he's going home.
I would say that James is probably a different person now and probably a stronger and wiser person than he was before.
Down there. It was such an enormous relief, you know, to think that he was ready to come home. I'm hoping that he can put all this horrible experience behind him, because he was so young to go through something like that.
If James can avoid cannabis, his chances of making a full recovery are good.
So how does it feel just to be able to open your front door and walk out into the world?
Feels really good. And now I'm back into the real world. I'm gonna stay there. So I'm gonna go down the park with my mates, maybe just have a couple of drinks, just to celebrate that I'm back.
And do you reckon anyone will be smoking dope?
There may be a couple of people who are doing it.
Are there any chance that the spliff will come your way?
Nah.
So you're determined to steer clear now?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not gonna touch it again.
Never smoke again?
Nah.
Young people cannot be certain what risks they take when they smoke cannabis. What we are all learning, and what teenagers need to know, is that if you start smoking the drug early and you smoke it a lot, then for some, the consequences can be very serious.
Koliko je marihuana opasna i kakvo je stanje u Hrvatskoj, razgovaramo sa stručnjakom za područje droga, doktorom Robertom Toreom iz kliničke bolnice Sestre Milosrdnice u Zagrebu. Doktor Tore, dobar dan.
Dobar dan.
Slažete li se vi sa ocjenama britanskih stručnjaka koje smo čuli u ovom dokumentarnom filmu?
Pa malo su me neugodno iznenadile osnovne teze i postavke ovog filma. On afirmira jednu vrlo radikalnu tezu koju zapravo, koja se rijetko pojavljuje. Pazite, pitanje zloupotrebe ilegalnih droga nije nikad u uskom smislu stručno medicinsko pitanje koje bi se recimo isključivo znanstveno tretiralo. To je javnozdravstveno ili javno pitanje, pa i političko pitanje. I desetljećima već traje jedan rat oko marihuane, ona ima poseban status među slučajno, gdje onda s jedne strane postoje zagovornici njene dekriminalizacije i legalizacije i afirmiraju neštetna djelovanja te droge, što više čak upuhuju da bi zloupotreba marihuane imala i korisne posljedice po osobni rast i razvoju pojedinaca koje puše, dok s druge strane postoji jaka struja osoba, znanstvenika, javnosti, stručne, nestručne, koja ide sa aspekta moralne panike i gdje nastoje hotimice utjerat određene nuspojave marihuane, nekad toliko jako kao što je glavna teza ovog BBC-ovog dokumentarca, da bi marihuana imala toliku snagu da bi uzrokovala ne samo psihotičan poremećaj, nego izrijekom schizofreniju kao najteži oblik psihičkog poremećaja.
Ali ona bi mogla biti okidač kod recimo ljudi koji imaju predispoziciju da
ima izvornu predispoziciju, da. U tom smislu okidač bi mogla biti, ali u tom smislu bi okidač moglo biti svaki stres. Te osobe su vrlo ranjive, vulnerabilne, krhke, porculanske i onda je obično u mladenačkom dobu se genetski aktivira taj jedan program poboljevanja od schizofrenije kao bolesti mozga, gdje kad bi roditelji urbanih tineđera na neki način i htjeli da je psihičko stanje njihove djece zapravo znak zloupotrebe droga, ona je zapravo znak razvoja genuinog nezavisno postojećeg psihičkog poremeća koji u to doba negdje počinje.
Možemo li onda tvrditi da je marihuana bezopasna, da pušenje marihuane nema nikakvih posljedica?
Jako je teško odgovoriti na ovo pitanje. Sa stručno-znanstvenog aspekta moglo bi se reći da pušenje marihuane ne izaziva neke u tjelesnom smislu ozbiljnije zdravstvene posljedice. Postoje doduše inih sitnih teza. Teza ovog filma je vrlo radikalna i ona zapravo pada u vodu. Zdravorazumski marihuana je ilegalna droga koja se masovno u milionskim brojevima zapravo puši skoro 40 godina u zemljama razvijenog zapada i da ona izaziva skizofreniju, onda bi nama bili već desetljećima katapultirani veliki broj skizofrenika među pušačima marihuane, među urbanom mladeži i obratno, onda među skizofrenicima bili pušača marihuane i među pušačima marihuane bilo puno skizofrenika, što mi kao zdravorazumsku činjenicu ne hvatamo da bi onda uzeli kao empirijsku osnovu za znanstveno istraživanje. Drugi su pokušaj utjerivanja štetnosti eventualne marihuane idu u raznim smjerovima, od kromosomskih deformacija, od utjecaja na endokrinološki aparat, testosteronski hormon, na psihičke posljedice, na smetnje u učenju. Tako da se sve te pojedine od teza imaju stanovito utemeljenje, ali nikad za sada dostatnu dokazanost. Tako da stručno utemeljeno se ne može baš utjerivati marihuani kao sredstvo ovisnosti neku značajniju štetu. Čak na neki način je i društvena opasnost od zloupotrebe marihuane u pušača nije velika. Ona je bitno manja nego kod konzumenata alkoholnih pića, no opet veća nego kod pušača cigareta, a daleko manja nego kod konzumenata ostalih droga.
Uzmimo jedan praktični primjer. Što je sa vožnjom? Netko ko puši marihuanu, kakvi su mu refleksi?
Marihuana ima utjecaj na slabljenje psihomotornih sposobnosti, koordinacije, finih motoričkih radnjih posebno, tako da pri vožnji su pušači marihuane i pod utjecajem marihuane znatno nesposobljeniji nego nepušači, iako u manjoj mjeri nego ljudi koji piju alkoholna pića, a tom prilikom vože.
Oni su na 0,0 sad svedeni po zakonu, prema tome i to bi trebalo. Šta je sa školom? Koliko ta djeca mogu pratiti nastavu?
Prosječna nekako dob pušenja marihuane...
Koja je to dob kod nas?
16 godina, 15-16 godina, to je prosječna dob.
Osnovna škola?
Da, kraj osnovne, početak srednje škole, tako da se u posljednjim razredima osnovne škole ili u prvim razredima srednje najčešće susreće naša urbana mladež. Marihuana je dalje dominantno urbana droga, iako to je jedna od rijetkih droga koja je prisutna i u ruralnim sredinama, posebno kod nas u Dalmaciji i na otočju. I ona izaziva određene smetnje pri upamćivanju, usvajanju novog gradiva. Duše, pohranu starih memorijskih jedinica ona ne osujećuje, ali velim upamćivanje, praćenje, smetnje pažnje, smetnje koncentracije izaziva, da.
Kad uspoređujemo recimo nas, odnosno Europu sa Amerikom, je li tamo ipak pad korištenja marihuane nego što se tiče Europe i ovih zemalja? Recimo, roditelji 70-ih koji su pušili. Šta je sa djecom danas?
Oduševljenje ovoga marihuanom tijekom 70-ih u okviru subkulturnog hipi pokreta, a onda je zauzela jednu platformu prohibitivnog odnosa prema drogama, svim, jedan rat protiv droga 80-ih, tako da možemo reći zapravo da današnja mladež, današnji američki tineđeri puše rijeđe marihuanu nego njihovi roditelji. Tako da taj broj opada. U Europi zastupljenost konzumacije marihuane nikad nije bila kao u tim godinama u Americi, ali ona ima zadržava uvijek jednu značajnu stopu, a kod nas je zloupotreba marihuane kontinuirano u trendovima porasta i ima to veze sa našom tranzicijom, sa otvaranjem prema zapadu, gdje mi zapravo usvajamo i pojedine navade i navike zapadnih zemalja koje nisu nam baš na čast i ponos. Iako još uvijek, recimo, naša mladež puši u značajno manjem broju, u značajno manjim količinama marihuanu nego zapadnoevropska mladež.
Je li znatiželja osnovni pokretač? I ako se ta znatiželja realizira, dakle, dijete popuši tu prvu cigaretu, šta dalje? Zašto onda?
Znatiželja, da, znatiželja je posebno inherentna mladom čovjeku, želja da se sve proba, da se sve mora iskusiti sad, odmah, ovdje.
Da, ali kad se proba, zašto onda dalje? Ta senzacija očito nije takva da bi trebalo nastavljati, kad si probao to.
Da, mladi ljudi zloupotrebljavaju ilegalne droge, pa među njima marihuanu, zbog istih razloga zbog kojih upotrebljavaju legalne droge. Zbog istih razloga zbog kojih posežu za alkoholom, zbog istih razloga posežu i za marihuanom, da se bolje zabave, da se bolje osjećaju, da se bolje priđu jedan drugom, da im razgovor ide bolje. Ciljaju na te pozitivne učinke koje droga u njima oslobađa. Sva sredstva ovisnosti, pa utoliko. I marihuana zapravo proizvodi psihijatrijske simptome. Da se tako ponaša, osjeća i doživljava osoba koja ništa nije uzela, mi bi smatrali psihijatrijski bolesnom, ali za razliku od klasičnih psihijatrijskih poremećaja, droge izazivaju simptome u kojima osoba koja ih uzima uživa. I ako njoj mijenjaju test realnosti, mijenjaju način doživljaja bivanja u svijetu, udaljuju od nas.
Da, realnost vraćaš kad ili tad.
Ali to ugodno osjećanje tendira da se ponovi, da se iskusi opet i opet.
Je li baš metoda vlastite kože najkorisniji način da se nešto proba i zadovolje znati želja?
Pa, odgovoriti uz jasnu postavku, da mi nećemo moći potpuno razvezati mlade ljude od droga. Ako ih zanimaju droge, to su mladi ljudi. Dobro je opet da ih u većem broju slučajeva zanima marihuana nego druge droge, da sami rade neku diferencijaciju. Zaista ipak je riječ o jednoj najmanje opasnoj od svih droga i bolje je da većina mladeži uzima, ako već nešto mora uzimati marihuanu, nego druge droge. Pušenje marihuane se naprosto prerasta.
Je li to zapravo uvod u uzimanje onda jačih droga? Je li to put?
U pravilu nije put. U pravilu nije put, iako velim uvijek se poklopi nekako tako nešto kaže. Zapravo ona kaskadna eskalacijska teorija da jedne droge vode drugima zapravo nije utvrđena, nije pokazana. Droge su zasebne, svaka ima svoju zasebnu opasnost, svoje zloupotrebe, ne vode jedni drugima. Samo vrlo mali postotak pušača marihuane zapravo kreće ka razvija kasnije u životu ovisnost o težim drogama, odnosno ovisnost kod nas o heroinu, gdje se zapravo iscrpljuje sav problem ovisnosti u Hrvatskoj.
Što mislite kad se govori o zakonskoj strani o kategorizaciji droga? Recimo to ima Velika Britanija, ima Danska, ima Nizozemska.
Pa sve zemlje zapravo.
Marihuana je u najnižoj, to je recimo C kategoriji.
Većina zemalja Zapadne Evrope polazi prema ilegalnim drogama sa pozicije platforme diferencijacije droga, gdje usvajaju da ne postoji droga, da postoje različite droge s različitim opasnostima njihove zloupotrebe i onda rade te kategorizacije, neke dekriminaliziraju, neke samo gone prekršajno bez kaznenog elementa. Ta zakonodavstva su dosta između sebe neusklađena, još mi nemamo recimo jedno jedinstveno, da bi se onda samo lakonski prepisalo što bi nam bilo i najbolje. Teško je utvrditi, pa su dosta neodređenim formulacijama u zakonima to regulirano, značajne količine, veće količine i što je zapravo dozvoljeno sucima niže razine da u praksi odlučuju uzimajući u kontekst posjed pojedine ilegalne droge. Kod nas mi nemamo tu platformu, mi sve droge kategoriziramo pod jedni pravni pojam, naziv opojnih droga, tako da zakon zapravo ne radi tu diferencijaciju, ali sudska praksa u efektivi usvojila je i senzibilna je na te neke činjenice da nisu sve droge jednako štetne ni opasne, pa usvajate tu kategorizaciju u praksi. Ona de facto postoji, ali de jure ne postoji. Bilo bi ju teško i provesti ili bilo značajnih otpora među našim pukom.
Temeljem prakse upravo su Danci i Nizozemci neke vrste marihuane uveli u višu kategoriju, dakle opasnijeg opijata.
Marihuana se masovno puši 30 godina i što se i onda je ona postala dosta značajna milijonskom broju ljudi, to možemo reći, to ipak reći o milionima ljudi. I onda su oni počeli raditi svojevrsnu genetski inženjering, svojevrsno umjetni uzgoj. Posvetili su joj pažnju kao i drugim poljoprivrednim kulturama i došli su do stabljika, biljki sa puno jačom zastupljenošću psihoaktivne supstance THC-a, tog tetrahidrokanabinola.
Koji pokreće to sve.
Koji ima glavno psihoaktivno djelovanje, a išli su i u smjeru da bi od izvorne, visoke, tanke biljke konoplje dobili malu grmoliku, tako rekuć, bonsai inačicu za kućni ilegalni uzgoj pod lampama i tu su zapravo dobili vrlo jake varijetete objedinjene na ulici pod nazivom skank, što bi mi domaći mogli prevesti kao tripozne trave, kako bi rekao, halucinogene trave. Jednu halucinogenu marihuanu koja po zastupljenosti tog tetrahidrokanabinola doseže i sustiže čak i hašiš. Dobro, pa onda to puno bitno jače djeluje, velim, od marihuane obične, kako bi rekao, velim, koja nema tako intenzivno djelovanje.
Završimo onda o marihuani. Za što se vi zalažete? Koje je vaše mišljenje? Vi ste stručnjak.
Ja se zalažem da struka otvoreno, stručno kaže da za sada se nisu stekli preduvjeti da bi marihuanu optuživali za prejaku štetnost, da bi se dokazala izrekom njena zdravstvena ili socijalna štetnost, društvena štetnost kod njene zloupotrebe, pa psihološka štetnost po te osobe. Sve te hipoteze u principu zatajuju. Da svakako činjenica, čak i dokazana činjenica da je marihuana znatno manje opasna od legalne droge alkohola, ne govori u korist njene dekriminalizacije. Ali ja se zalažem za činjenicu da mi ne zloupotrebljavamo znanost da bi držali da bi se oduprijeli naletima eventualne dekriminalizacije marihuane. Da zapravo trend je Svjetske zdravstvene organizacije ne prema legalizaciji ilegalnih droga, čak i u ovom slučaju gdje marihuana ima zaista poseban status, ovako bi se reklo približiti sa nečemu što bi mogli reći ilegalnoj drogi, ovako, ali bez obzira čak i na to, trend Svjetske zdravstvene organizacije je u diskretnoj prohibiciji upotrebe legalnih droga i zaciji posebno prekršajnoj, a ne prema uvođenju još novih droga. I da mi možemo i kao narod odlučiti da mi ne želimo pored 2 legalna psihoaktivna svojstva uvesti još i treće. Da nam ne treba da ipak je to opojno sredstvo koje mijenja percepciju stvarnosti, da nam ne ide baš ni s ova 2. I da nismo baš, ne postižemo, nismo baš neka ni mentalna svježina, ni bistrina, ni s alkoholom, ni s cigaretama. I ono košta i uzima svoje žrtve, da nam ne treba treće zlo, ali da mi naprosto ne moramo onda instrumentalizirati znanost i struku da bi dobivali nategnute zaključke. Da možemo otvoreno, političko, referendumski reći ne, marihuana ne. Zato jer to nećemo.
Ali istovremeno možemo i upozoriti jednako kao što upozoravamo u akcijama protiv pušenja ili protiv alkohola, jednako tako i protiv marihuane. Hvala vam, doktor.
Hvala vama.
Iduće subote govorimo o nasilju. Zemlji koja je raj za ubojice. To je Gvatemala, koja nosi neslavan rekord po broju ubojstava i to žena. No nisu na dijelu serijski ubojice, već zastrašujuća kultura. Ako je žena ubijena, za to je sigurno postojao neki opravdan razlog. Zbog takvog stajališta ne vode se ni ozbiljne istrage. U posljednjih 4 godine ubijeno ih je 1500. Previše i za standarde Južne Amerike. Zašto vlasti to gotovo mirno promatraju? O svemu tome za 7 dana. Do tada, hvala vam i doviđenja.